Fantastic. Well, thank you all for coming. Great to see you all. I love this conference. I actually came last year, and I remember being in a conversation with a kind of private equity bro and a farmer with biochar covered hands, and they were shaking hands over a deal, and I thought that was just like the epitome of a market at the early days. So great to be back, and thank you for having us. I'm going to walk you through the presentation, but just to kick us off first, I'm going to hand over to Mark for his own personal intro. Then I'm going to introduce myself and the company briefly, and then we're going to get to it. So over to you, Mark.
Thanks. How are you guys doing today? My name is Mark. I'm the head of science at Residual. My background is technical, so I have degrees in chemistry and physics and environmental engineering. I led the science team at One Shot Earth and Cloverly, and in that role, or in those roles, my responsibility was the assessment of carbon credits in the voluntary carbon market. Today, my role is more implementation than assessment, and we work on the design of biochar and similar projects on the VCM. Ted?
Fantastic. I'm Ted. I'm one of the co-founders of Residual. I'm originally from the UK, now based out of New York, and my background is in climate research and carbon ratings. So I started off my career at a think tank in the UK called Onward, where I set up a cross-party commission on climate, got fascinated by industrial decarbonisation and carbon removals, really there. Then was the head of carbon removals at a company called B0 Carbon, which is a carbon credit ratings agency. So think of it a bit like how S&P and Moody's operate in financial markets. They operate in the voluntary carbon market. I was focused on developing frameworks to assess carbon removals, and then I moved over to the US and was focused on getting the big buyers using ratings. So signed on Microsoft as a client, Google, JP Morgan, and got to know really on quite a granular level both what the buyers and the ratings agencies wanted, but also what the project level risk really looked like from a credit perspective. And that was kind of the foundation of what became Residual, because what I saw and what my co-founder Laura saw was really a misalignment between what the big buyers, the insurers, the ratings agencies, the financiers wanted from biochar credit projects, and what the suppliers were bringing to the market. And there was this fundamental gap that needed to be bridged. And so we set up Residual really to tackle that, and we are a specialist project developer focused on de-risking projects at the design stage. And so today we're going to be talking you through a little bit of our secret sauce and a bit about how we view quality in the market. So I think the first thing to say is if you're not familiar with the credit side of biochar, there is a huge gap in price across the market. So on the same day, my co-founder Laura, she was an insurer in this space. She insured two biochar credit projects, one at $70 a ton and the other at $200 a ton. And this is a huge variance here. And the really key thing that is differentiated between these two prices is trust. And the two pillars of integrity which find that trust is what we're going to be talking about today. And that is carbon integrity, which Mark is going to walk you through in a moment. And then what I'm going to talk you through towards the end is project execution.
Thanks, Ted. There are three variables by which to assess a carbon credit project. These are additionality, permanence, and carbon accounting. If you want to attract buyers on the voluntary carbon market, you have to create a narrative around your project for each of these variables. So today I'll walk you through each one and talk about how they relate to biochar projects specifically. The first is additionality. This is the concept that your project would not exist without the intervention of carbon finance. The most important aspect of this is likely financial additionality. This is especially key for biochar projects as they have alternative revenue streams, including biochar energy, etc. Another piece of additionality is alternative scenario analysis. So this is considering what other applications your feedstock might have, whether that's combustion, anaerobic digestion, et cetera, and comparing the economic viability to the financial viability of the biochar to these alternative scenarios. Finally, it's important to set a precedent or a counterfactual. What would have happened to your feedstock without the intervention of this project? So if I'm assessing a project in the VCM for additionality, an example of one that might have a poor additionality is one that's over-reliant on revenue streams that are not carbon credits. So if 99% of my project, my biochar project, relies on revenue from energy and biochar sales, while only 1% relies on the sale of carbon credits, we would consider this to be a poor project or non-additional. The next aspect or variable that we might consider is carbon accounting. This is the idea that I'm correctly quantifying how much CO2 equivalent I'm sequestering. In order to do this effectively on the voluntary carbon market, you need to consider an LCA that's comprehensive and covers cradle to gate. You also have to have an MRV process that's thorough, repeatable, and representative of all your batches. And then finally, you have to create a baseline that's compelling. So if I have a project that, for example, doesn't include important emissions like inherent emissions in my machinery or construction emissions, that would be missing aspects of carbon accounting that would make this a low-quality project. The last aspect is permanence. So permanence is the idea that whatever CO2 sequestered that I quantified will continue to be sequestered throughout time or throughout the length of the contract. Metrics to prove permanence include HC-org ratio or random reflectance, and then you also must be able to prove that these metrics are representative for all your batches, right, rather than one. And then finally, your end use has to be a use that perpetuates the durability of your biochar. So for example, if I'm creating biochar and then using it to oxidize material in a steel furnace, this would be destructive of our sample, and it would have low permanence or be considered a low quality project.
Fantastic, thank you, Mark. So the second kind of broad pillar is project execution. So what Mark kind of talked through there was really the carbon risk for these projects. And here we're talking about what is the likelihood that this project actually executes its operations as intended from the outset. And so we've sort of broadly spread this out over the next 3 slides. The first one I'm going to talk about here really is the tech and the team. So the tech here, we're talking about the pyrolysis technology. So from an execution standpoint, the key thing here is that it doesn't break down. You know, we see projects day in, day out across the world that will get technology that lasts 1-2 years, and then they have to go back to the drawing board, they have to do major adaptations. That's what you really need to think about when you're thinking about execution risk here. And there is a huge variance in quality and price of these machines as well. You know, there's 2 machines that we've vetted. One is around $10 million, one is around $100,000. That is a 100x difference, and the difference in quality is not 100x, but there is large variability there. The second is the team, the proponent experience. And so for us, we partner traditionally with big biogenic waste producers, big industrials, and that track record of that counterparty, of that supplier is really, really important. And so to give you context for this, we've had, as a business, 12 projects that have wanted to do development partnerships with us, and only 6 have passed our diligence. 6 of them failed, and a lot of that was down to the team experience and the proponent risk. Next up is the feedstock and logistics. So it is really important to have rock solid, long-term feedstock contracts with these projects. You know, there's a lot of discussion around, and we'll be in Climate Week in New York this year, around that competition of biomass in 10, 20 years. And the contracts that you have to bind in that feedstock is going to be really important to navigate against any of that variability. Next is on kind of logistics. You know, just practically, you know, when you're looking at a project's viability, how far are you transporting that biomass? You know, how far are you then having to transport the biochar when you're putting it back into the soil or wherever you might be putting it? You know, how are you thinking about the processing? You know, how much moisture is there in that feedstock? You know, do you have to do a lot of chipping? Do you have to do a lot of drying? All of these things are really integral when we're looking at the viability for some of these projects. And then the final kind of bucket here is kind of finance and policy more broadly. So on the finance side, when you're talking to a ratings agency, an insurer, an off-taker, having that first project locked in from a financing perspective is a massive boost. It makes it a lot easier to have those conversations. If you're speaking to a big off-taker that wants to get credits, if you're going to them with no idea about what you're doing with the financing, that is a huge risk for them that they don't want to undertake. The second piece here is on policy. So you'll see around the world today, my background is in policy, I'm from the UK, as you might be able to tell, and there has been big progress in the last few years. I initially started working on it back in 2019, this stuff, advising the government on some of these things, and it's finally sort of getting there. But that's one example of where a regulated market for durable carbon removal is emerging, and I know that biochar is one of the protocols which is going to be brought in the next few years. So being in a jurisdiction where there is that long-term demand signal is really, really beneficial from a kind of just a project viability perspective, because relying on just the voluntary market for the next sort of 30 years has its risks.
It's also important to be forward-looking in all of these aspects of quality. You don't want to meet the standards where they're at today. You want to anticipate where they will be. And that's certainly true if you don't want to give a discount to your earlier vintages. I think an example of this is Puro's methodology going from 15 pages to 140. Obviously, there's a lot more material covered now that their earlier biochar projects wouldn't have included in their assessment. And so that's Residual's focus. We have some examples up here, but Residual's focus is anticipating what quality will mean 5 to 10 years from now, rather than just for the projects today.
Brilliant. And why should you care about the quality of your carbon credits? I mean, obviously, there's the climate impact here. That is the central focus of why we're doing what we do. And the key thing here to know is that quality now drives price. And so that is a really important thing that I really saw grow when I was in the rating space. So I used to work for B0, that middle logo. There's also Silvera, Calix. These are the ratings agencies in the space. There's been the emergence of the new registries in the space, many of whom I think are here today. And there is really a premium on quality, and that is emerging ever more. So this is just one example of a project that when I was in the rating space, we rated, and it was selling at $220 per ton, per credit. And the day that A rating went live, it's not even the highest rating, it was the third highest rating, that credit sold out on the ex-post exchanges, and they gave a case study to us to say that they got 2 long-term offtakes directly off the back of that rating. And so this is all to say that if you do the early work and you really are thoughtful about how you design projects at the outset, there is a really strong premium in price, and that's really what we're focused on, is creating really high quality biochar credit projects. But yeah, that is time for questions, I think. So thank you very much.